And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hi there, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook on this Friday, August 2nd, 2024. And this outlook is for the weekend, Saturday and into Sunday. We start out with the sea ice on this Friday afternoon, and we still have some ice, especially up here off the Arctic coast, but essentially the Chukchi Sea coastline from just southwest of Utqiagvik off of Wainwright all the way down through the Bering Strait is ice-free, and we continue to expect the ice just to slowly continuing to melt off here along the Arctic coast areas. And we are going to see some warmer temperatures this weekend, especially by Sunday along the Arctic coast, so that should help facilitate that late summer melting. And looking at the surface weather map late tonight, early Saturday morning, a ridge of high pressure over the Gulf. This is a reflection of what's happening in the mid and upper levels of the atmosphere. A stronger mid and upper level ridge will be building along the Gulf, along the Panhandle coast, up into the eastern mainland this weekend and early next week. That's going to allow things to dry up and warm up. Meanwhile, the stormier pattern will be what systems are moving in off the Bering or lows coming up out of the North Pacific. This is going to keep the weather active, cooler than normal, with bouts of rain and wind. The Alaska Peninsula, even up to Kodiak Island later this weekend by the time we get into Sunday and Monday. And also southwest coastline interior up through the Seward Peninsula and Bering Strait. So Saturday afternoon, the high pressure ridge continues to build, will be firmly established, allowing temperatures to start to rebound and warm again across south central, southeast interior, as well as the Panhandle. Another low in the North Pacific, some energy and moisture from that. It's going to be lifting northward, linking up with this front crossing the Bering Sea. So by Sunday, we still have the ridge in place, keeping it warmer and drier across the Panhandle, eastern interior, even up into Upper Cook Inlet. This low, though, will begin to pump moisture up toward Kodiak Island and along the Alaska Peninsula, eventually forcing it out across the southwest coast into the interior. And this system will continue lifting northward. We anticipate for the marine forecast Saturday, north winds 10 knots, Lynn Canal and Stevens Passage waves a couple of feet, northwest winds to 15 knots, 3-foot waves there around Ketchikan, Metlakatla, Dixon Entrance. Generally northwest winds to 20 knots offshore of Gustavus, Sitka, Craig, with swells 4 to 6 feet there in the nearshore waters within 15 nautical miles of the Panhandle coast. More westerly winds to 15 knots outside there of Yakutat Bay with waves 3 to 4 feet. Sunday, north winds to 15 knots, Lynn Canal, northwest winds 10 to 15 knots, Stevens Passage down through Dixon Entrance, the outer coast, Sitka down through off of Craig. Look for northwest winds continuing around 20 knots, 15-knot northwest winds west of Gustavus, and then as we get out toward Cape Suckling, west winds to 10 knots. For the northwestern portion of the Gulf, variable winds around 10 knots within Prince William Sound, waves a foot or two. Outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance, west winds 10 knots, waves a couple of feet. Variable winds to 10 knots off the Kenai coast. Strongest winds 20-25 knots here at the entrance, Kennedy Entrance on into Lower Cook Inlet with swells 4 or 5 feet. And for Sunday, we still will have variable winds around 10 knots outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance and Prince William Sound with waves running 2, maybe 3 feet. Strongest winds will be easterly there at the entrance of Cook Inlet, 25 knots, swells 6 to 7 feet. And northeasterly winds around 10 knots, upper middle Cook Inlet with waves of 2 to 3 feet. Around Kodiak Island on Saturday, variable winds 15 knots within Shelikof Strait. Southeast winds to 20 knots off of Akiak. And as we go down along the length of the Alaska Peninsula, that occluded front that's lifting northward could bring east to northeast winds 25 to 30 knots off of Chiknik and Sand Point. Otherwise, generally east-southeast winds to 20 knots, Bristol Bay down to north of Cold Bay, waves running a few feet there. By Sunday, we anticipate a little stronger winds through Shelikof Strait northeasterly at 30 knots. And southeasterly winds to 30 knots there east of Chiknik and southwest of Kodiak Island, and then across the Alaska Peninsula. East winds 20 knots on the North Pacific side, southeast winds to 25 knots along the Bering side with waves of 3 to 4 feet. Eastern Aleutians, generally southeast winds 20 to 25 knots, turning southerly Atka to Adak, shifting back to the southwest to west 20 to 25 knots west of Adak. And for Sunday, still east-southeast winds vicinity of Dutch Harbor and around the far eastern Aleutians. Kind of a mixed bag, turning though northwesterly west of Nikolsky. From Atka back through Adak, Kiska, look for northwest winds at about 15 to 20 knots. And along the west and southwest coast, we are looking at a stronger southerly flow into Kuskokwim Bay along the lower Yukon Delta up into the wider expanse here of Norton Sound. South winds to 30 knots extending all the way back out to St. Matthew. And then for Sunday, we still will have winds upwards southeast winds 30 to even 35 knots, Bristol Bay up into Kuskokwim Bay. And then southerly flow continues at 30 knots there along the lower Yukon Delta and up into the wider expanse here of Norton Sound. And for the Bering Strait on Saturday, generally southeast winds 20 knots, waves 5-6 feet. Southeast winds across the lower Chukchi Sea at 20 knots. East-southeast winds 10 to 15 knots off of Wainwright to Utqiagvik, and then generally south-southeast winds as you get from Utqiagvik to Kaktovik, and waves 2, maybe 3 feet at best. For Sunday, we continue to see south-southeast winds 15 to 20 knots along the Arctic coast, bringing down some warmer temperatures along the coastline for the late weekend. Winds remain brisk from the south. We expect throughout the Chukchi Sea, especially from Cape Lisburne, Point Hope, all the way down through the lower Chukchi Sea and the Bering Strait to the north side of St. Lawrence Island, where we do expect swells of 8 to 9 feet, the Bering Strait to the north side of St. Lawrence.